Hi, I'm Jonathan Leeman. Welcome to Pastoring in a Pandemic, where I have a daily conversation with different pastor friends of mine through the month of May. Conversations about pastoring in this unusual moment. And to have the conversation today is my good friend Collin Hansen. Collin is the executive director or the editorial director or
Editorial
something
director.
director.
Don't promote me, Jonathan. Don't promote me. That'll get me in trouble.
Sorry,
I don't want
he's
that
not
job.
he's not conspiring to be the executive director. He's
I don't
just
want that
the
job.
meek, humble, serve everybody editorial director at the Gospel Coalition. He's the author of several books. He basically created the Young Restless Reform movement. It exists because of him.
Named it, not created it. I named
Oh,
it.
okay, you're right.
Give me.
Sorry. But most importantly, among all of these different titles and accolades we might raise, he is a pastor, one of the elders at Redeemer Community Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Brother, grateful you're here.
Thanks,
A
Jonathan.
question. You're a baseball fan
Big baseball fan, yeah.
and a Washington Nationals fan.
No, not a Washington Nationals fan. Though my in-laws or my sister-in-law and brother-in-law, big Nationals fans right there in Washington, D.C., Arlington.
How do you there's my Nationals hat.
Beautiful.
See
Beautiful.
that?
Very happy for you.
World Series champs, by the way. Who's your team?
Kansas City Royals, 2015 World Series champions.
Okay, that's legitimate. You know what walk-on music is?
It's true.
We're low budget here. We can't play music. What is your walk-on music for this conversation?
Probably would be Alabama Pines by Jason Isbell, one of my favorite artists. And yeah, that would be my mood walk-up music. It's not like pump you up stuff, but again, I'm not trying to pump up, but it's like mood setting walk-up music. That's what I do.
You're a thoughtful man. You want to set the mood.
I try.
How does that go? I don't know that song. Can you sing it for us? A couple
I'm
bars?
definitely not going to sing it for you. So think Jason Isbell's like rock/country. He's one of the best crossing those genres. And when I moved to the South, it was a genre that I started to get into a lot more. So
you can't give us one bar. Come on, one bar.
No, I'm not giving you one bar.
I'll play the drums.
I'm not doing this, Jonathan. People can look it up. He just dropped a new album, Reunions. Check it out. Jason Isbell. Tell him I sent you.
All right. Good stuff. Thank you. Well, what I want to talk to you about today is change and fear of change and what changes, what stays in the same. Because a lot of people are a little panicked, a little concerned. Hey, everything's going to change. You see a lot of voices saying things are going to change, even in the commercials. Oh, it's a time of uncertainty and so forth, right? Even evangelical voices, those speaking to pastors, which this conversation is trying to do, say a lot of that. I think of, Andy Crouch wrote an article. He says we need to treat COVID-19 as an economic and cultural blizzard, winter, and beginning of a little ice age, a once in a lifetime change that is likely to affect our lives and organizations for years. Another prominent pastor who's got a ministry to other pastors says churches that have the largest impact will think of themselves as digital organizations with physical expressions rather than as physical organizations with digital presences. He's saying this is going to change the way we do church, right? One other pastor saying, hey, we're going to move from analog to digital, from teaching to equipping, from gathering to connecting, from attending to engagement. So a lot of these kind of prognosticators out there are telling us everything's changing, including in the church. You are a social media, web space, cultural identifier dude. You write about cultural changes, younger.
It's on my business card. Exactly that phrase, actually.
Is all of this 100% true, 50% true, from your perch as a theologian, but also as a pastor, but also as a journalist? Are things changing that radically for us?
No, that's the short answer to that question, Jonathan. A lot of the prognostications, including my own, came fairly early on in the pandemic. Now, I've gone back and revisited some of what I've written in early April, and I stand by almost everything that I said there. But it is so interesting that in your mind that every week, every month brings changing perspective. And yet, for some reason, it still catches us off guard. And some of those major, I think it's interesting that a lot of prognostications tend to confirm the predictors' prior convictions, and that includes myself on this. We're all more likely to see what we want to see come out of this. And so what I want to see come out of this is a reaffirmation of the gathered priority of the local church. And I have an interesting dynamic here where I'm working in the local church, as you said, pastoring there. And then at the same time, I'm working online. And for years, Jonathan, I've been trying to figure out how to explain to pastors what has really changed in the digital age. Because what are we, 25, 30 years into the internet revolution? That's still early on for something that's so incredibly transformative as the internet. So we're still feeling around with that kind of thing. And this is the first major disruption that is connected to that media transformation. Okay, so it's a good time to stop, take stock of what's going on. And as you said, a lot of people are saying, okay, this is really pretending a new digital future for the local church. Jonathan, I think the opposite of that. I think the opposite. I think, yes, there will probably be some holdovers in terms of live streaming and things like that. I mean, for the foreseeable future, because not everybody's going to be able to gather, and not every church is going to do that, obviously, but some that would not have done that before will do that now, at least for a while, and maybe even permanently. But that becoming the major focus of what they do, I don't see that at all. What I see is that a lot of churches have thought of themselves, I think, as sort of like sub-content creators, I think especially in the Reformed space. And it's like every church has to duplicate all of the content production that you would have expected them to have done 50 years ago or something, as long as they weren't, getting all their material from the Baptist Sunday School Board or something like that. And I keep thinking, no. Digitally speaking, ministries like the Gospel Coalition can go out there and get all sorts of things for you pretty rapidly. You don't have to sit there and study congregational singing. Does it spread COVID-19? Well, we can go get that information. You don't have to spend time on that. But what you do need to do is focus on the things that no digital enterprise can ever do: discipline, pastor your church, counsel, administer the ordinances, all those kind of visitations, things like that. So I think the opposite. I don't see churches rushing into the digital. They'll have to maintain a presence there. I see them hopefully reasserting the primacy of the gathered body and doing the work of local church pastoral ministry that only they can do, that can never be substituted by the digital.
Is that just, play devil's advocate for a second, is that just, you talked about everybody's kind of prognosticating according to the prior convictions. Is that you just prognosticating according to your prior convictions?
Well, I think it's unavoidable at some level to be thinking that
Yeah.
way. So,
Yeah.
but I was a pastor friend of mine, and he and I had this conversation last fall, because there are certain things that a church must do, but a church can't be good at everything. And so that's where the work of theological vision comes into play, to ask what the Lord has called this specific body of believers to do to fulfill the Great Commission in their environment. And we were working through this because, again, we're a large and growing church that can't do everything well. And so where do you figure out where to emphasize? Where do you figure out where to invest more of your resources, your time, and your attention? And we had this conversation last fall, and he reached out to me in the middle of this pandemic and said, I keep revisiting that conversation again and again, because it's become so much more evident now of how important that transition is, to focus on the things that only we can do in this gathered body. I'll give you an illustration, Jonathan, that may help with this. I've noticed that preaching virtually, and I've been mostly watching this, I'm not the preaching pastor in our church. Preaching is totally different, and I think very unsatisfying. So I've not been sort of a leading advocate against video venue multi-site churches, though I don't like them. But I see more and more that preaching ought not to be taken away from the live in-person dynamic. And that may be, in fact, intrinsic to the whole enterprise of preaching. In fact, my own pastor, when I talked with him about this, said, I don't even consider what I'm doing right now to be preaching.
Hmm.
And I don't know if that was a theological statement or if it was more of an experiential statement. This doesn't feel like preaching. But I'll tell you, Jonathan, it doesn't look like preaching to me, because I'll give you an example of what happens. It comes across totally differently because you're separated by this screen. And so obviously there's no feedback. And what I've noticed is that things don't come across the same way. Some things are not funny, some things are more harsh. And you realize that when you're together, and in our church, you've got people who have been together for decades. When you're surrounded by people who know and love you in person, the preaching comes across totally differently. But when that's absent, there's not that relationship, there's not that connection in person, it doesn't sound the same, it doesn't feel the same. And that's what, so maybe it is my priors that I'm confirming, but what it's doing, I think, Jonathan, is it is sort of drawing out things that I had convictions about, but I've never seen the alternative. Now I'm seeing the alternative, and I'm deepened in my original convictions.
Yeah, no doubt. Last Sunday, my church of about 100 people does a Zoom call on Sunday morning. I gave the devotion on Sunday, 1 John chapter 1, just walked through it, gave some application. And I was doing it in just basically like this. And so I have a picture of me, and then these little pictures, because I'm the one talking, I'm the big face that I see.
Yeah, right.
It's like I'm almost preaching to myself, but I also kind of want that there, so I can make sure that my video's working and all of that's doing what it's supposed to. And then these little pictures of some of them along the side. Okay, preaching to yourself, which is a good thing to do in one's own heart, is a different thing than on Sunday morning. It changes the dynamic of what you're doing. And it occurs to me that people say, oh, here we are on Zoom, we're gathered. Well, it's almost Gnostic, isn't it? Just to be philosophical for a second. We're embodied creatures. God means for us to be together physically, spiritually, emotionally, and being in a room, a physical, incarnate room, is significant to what we are as human beings, as creatures. And to pretend as if this flat screen in which we're transmitting information to one another is the same, in a sense, is a kind of minimized anthropology, one almost wants to say, right? It's making the creature and creaturely embodiment and creaturely togetherness in those bodies less significant than what God intended in creation, right? Yeah. So all this talk of, hey, we can do all of this digital, we can gather digitally. It's like you have a shallow and thin view of what God created us to be. So yeah, those are my prior convictions. And yeah, those are going to transmit to my analysis of these things. Nonetheless, I think those are things that people are going to have been even discovering in the last couple of months. So I appreciate your. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think we're thinking this.
Jonathan, I was against Zoom before everybody else was against Zoom. I mean, I like being able to talk with you here, but I've been working remote for the last 10 years of my life. If you throw in seminary, the remote work for 3 more years before that. So I was using Zoom, all this kind of stuff. I find, Jonathan, that the distinction between our work at the Gospel Coalition, which is entirely remote, except for events that we pull off.
And digital,
right. So I think the distinction between that and all of us being embedded in our local churches is exactly the dynamic that we need to be able to differentiate the work that we do from the work of the local church. So it never feels like what we're doing at the Gospel Coalition is any kind of substitute for church. And we never think that that's an aspiration of ours. We're merely trying to support the church. And all we do is we take the ideas and the needs that we experience as pastors and leaders in our local churches, we bring them to the digital space to be able to find good answers to them. And then we spread it out to all these other churches to take from the digital space to go back to their local space. there. And so I like remote work for that reason, but it helps to keep those things differentiated. What I'm doing at thegospelcoalition.org is not the church, and it should never be seen
Yeah.
as any kind of substitute for that.
Yeah. TGC, 9 Marks can do what we do digitally because all we're doing is we're trying to supply, equip, give some help to come alongside para church,
Right.
the local church. The church is not that. I love what you said earlier. You said churches are tempted to see themselves. What did you say as content providers?
Yes.
But
yes.
But they're more than that, of course.
Right.
They do provide some content. They point to the Bible and say, live
Right.
this way. Jesus is Lord. But we're also a family.
Right.
So, okay, parents provide content for their children, but don't parent digitally. We get together at the family dinner table.
Yeah. Well, I can speak, I try to speak pragmatically to it at some point, because I say, look, it's just not efficient for all of you to spend all of this time producing, again, having to study every issue. And I'm not talking about like, you should go get your sermons or things like that from the Gospel Coalition. It just helps you to realize what I provide as a pastor that's unique is the way I bring that content, namely the Bible, to bear on these specific people. I am not speaking into the ether. I'm not speaking into the camera. I'm not speaking into a vague area. I am bringing the gospel to bear on these people at this place at this time. And the best way that I can do that contextualization work is not by spending all of my time on Twitter to see what those people are talking about, but by spending time with my actual church members and with my neighbors in my community. And those are the people that I'm called to be able to primarily serve. If this whole thing brings a reorientation to church pastors to focus on that, then I will have been thankful at least for that aspect of the pandemic.
Let me try to clarify sharpen the image, focus. Talking digitally here, a little bit further. You are a pastor, but you're also a parachurch web content provider.
Right.
What's the difference between those two hats for you? What do you want? In other words, here's what I really want you to speak to. Help the pastors have a clear vision of what they are with the pastor hat on versus social media provider hat on.
Yeah. Well, so when I'm trying to think about digital content, you're trying to think globally. You're trying to think of how a million different people are going to react to this kind of thing. It's almost an impossible task, but you have anything you post on the internet can go to anybody at any time. So it totally changes that dynamic. But as a pastor, I'm thinking about specific local conditions. I'm thinking about very specific individuals there. And again, I want the same gospel consolation. I want the same basic content to be able to go to both places. But it's entirely, just talking to Twitter is not the same thing as talking to your friend in the church. So again, I'll give you an illustration here. I was talking with the home group leaders that as a pastor and an elder who I oversee within our church. So it's about 6 different home groups, so 120 to 150 members of our church that I'm responsible for there. And I was asking the different home group leaders about how they've been experiencing the pandemic. And Jonathan, it was an interesting response. Almost all of them said, this is one of the greatest times of their lives. I said, we've had so much
pandemic.
The pandemic has been one of the greatest times of their lives because they've had so much time together, less work, less stress, more time to exercise, more time to read the Bible, hours of time spent devotionally, prayerfully, all that sort of stuff. And I remember thinking, well, that's not what I had expected to hear. I also noticed that almost none of them had children in the home. I think made a pretty big difference, a determinative one. But it helped me to realize, Jonathan, that what I'm trying
we love our kids.
Yeah, yes, right, yeah. Yes. In the end, I basically just said, I love you guys, but I resent you right now. I love my children to death, but it is a particular challenge. So the point is, I can't sit here with my content creator hat and be able to somehow triangulate how millions of people around the world are experiencing this thing to be able to exactly, precisely be able to deliver whatever spiritual encouragement or challenge or exhortation that they need. But I can know these people and I know the way they're experiencing it. Let me speak more broadly about our church. Our church, because of our demographics, because of our geography, has been largely unaffected economically at this point. So the stuff that you talked about earlier from Andy Crouch, it may hit us at some point. You got to be somewhat prepared for that, of course. But it would be foolish for us to take New York City conditions and apply them to our context in Birmingham, Alabama. They are not the same. Or to take a congregation that's largely 60 or 70 and older and apply it to a congregation whose average age is closer to about 26. It wouldn't make sense. So there's no, I mean, I try to serve both things, but I think about it this way, Jonathan. My local church work is the primary work. And whatever I do digitally is meant to support that work. So again, the ideas are less likely to come from, hey, guess what? I was talking with a bunch of my friends, on Twitter or something like that. And I thought they had a really good idea that I need to impose on us now. No. It's much more likely that I'm going to say, hey, what are we experiencing and feeling? How are we seeing the Lord at work in our midst? And how can we then take that digitally to try to serve other churches in that situation as well?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think one of the lies, not lies, one of the temptations of this social media age is every pastor feels tempted to have a ministry to the church, capital C,
Right.
and can even give a kind of priority to that can distract them. And I think true ministry is going to grow out of your ministry to the small C church. I mean, honestly, I'll just confess, in my own life, I've seen that temptation. Right? Oh, I'm really busy with 9 Mark stuff. I don't have time for some of that eldering stuff. And when I give into that temptation, I feel a little bit like a hypocrite. Like this is a wrongful prioritization of my own life. Now, 9 Marks is my job. That content is my job, so I do have to do that. But it has no integrity if it's not coupled with in growing out of that local small C church ministry. Right. Gosh, there's a lot of other things I want to ask you about. This article you wrote, 5 predictions for the COVID-19 aftermath. You obviously don't feel presumptuous talking about the future. You feel fine to say, this is what's going to happen.
Tentative predictions, Jonathan.
By the way, anything for past.
That came from pastors reaching out to me saying, we need help to kind of know, we're hearing so much out there. Can you help us to synthesize? One thing that my job affords me that is very helpful is I get a lot of time, way more time than pastors typically get, to be able to read widely on things. Mm-hmm. So that's one area that I was trying to serve pastors who are having to make decisions about things by synthesizing a lot of information out there and presenting it in a way that would help them to think themselves through the crisis.
And you do a great job, genuinely. As I said on the pastor's talk I did with you, I'm so grateful for Gospel Coalition and its ministry and your ability to serve pastors in precisely that way. I know you have your critics. I am not among them. 2 things real fast. Just two of your 5 predictions. Just what do you mean by this, and how is this relevant for pastors? And you give me like 15 seconds on each. You said, number 1, we lose trust even as we gain solidarity. What does that mean, and how is that relevant for pastors?
Solidarity means that everybody is going through the same basic kind of thing, but as we talked about before, they're going through it in totally different ways. This is the first completely shared experience globally that's like this, that shows solidarity. It'll be something we can always refer to, but the distrust has grown. A shared experience, we're all experiencing it differently. And what we're seeing right now with the reopen is that every church, every individual's experience, they may have gone through the same thing, but they didn't go through it the same way. That is going to be a massive challenge for pastors.
Distrust in government, distrust in
each other,
churches,
distrust in their
pastors?
Church leaders. Absolutely. So, I mean, again, we're talking in the context of reopening, completely across the spectrum of you waited way too long because you XYZ trust the government and the experts too much, or you went way too quickly because you're too selfish and you're interested in just getting your own money back in the church. I mean, there's going to be the entire kind of realm of experience there in response to that. That's really hard. Shutting down was easy.
Yeah.
Reopening, extremely hard.
Yeah. I feel you're right. I feel like everybody's kind of all on the same page and shutting down, but as we come out of it, people are going to do faster, slower, trust
Correct.
more, trust less. I fear it could get messy. Second one, we'll see spiritual hunger with naturalistic hopes.
Yeah. So this has really been a time of despair, in part because of turning on each other, and in part of just because of the stress that's maintained. Think about the mothers who are trying to work at home, to care for the home. Also, if they have jobs that are trying to do in the home and trying to take care of children, just this is an extremely vulnerable time. People are going to come out of this with really bad, I mean, really deep wounds, maybe even physically if they've been abused. So there's a lot of like opportunity and need, that spiritual hunger, that stoke that the gospel, of course, speaks to, that Christ can bring consolation to. But the problem is, you don't see any sort of broad turn to say, hey, what we need is a spiritual solution to these problems. President Trump hasn't even really bothered to bring any of that leadership or featured pastors, and nobody even really expects him to. After 9/11, you have Billy Graham come address the nation who gathers together. There's been nothing like that. All of the response to us has been, when's the vaccine? Where is the treatment? What works? Spiritual hunger, naturalistic hopes. I don't know how it's going to work out, but they're both happening at the same time.
I had a great conversation. I don't know when actually this one's going to come. I had a great conversation with David Platt, and the main thing he kind of kept saying over and over is Christians are all saying, "Hey, we want to," or everybody, including Christians, we want to get back to the way things were. And David just sounded a strong note of, no, we're pushing ahead to what the Lord intends for us, the good He has intends for us through all of this. We don't need to go back; we need to go forward. And I really appreciated
And it
that.
won't be the same anyway. I mean,
No, that's right.
you can't turn the clock back on that. We will not be the same people having experienced this. That's not all bad. I'm just
Yeah,
saying, just there's no such thing as going back to the way things were before.
yeah, yeah. And God has good in it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's 2 years from now. Lo and behold, somehow there's a great vaccine, and we're kind of coming out of this, Lord willing. What do you hope to have learned about the Lord in this time?
I think it's exactly that point that we were just talking about there, Jonathan. One of the spiritual disciplines I've undertaken during this time is to go back through my own life, even to go back through world history and see that whatever it appears, we're also preaching through Genesis and just wrapped it up last week in our church with the story of Joseph. So I've been primed for this kind of response, but just going back and saying, rarely do things turn out the way that you kind of want them to originally or the way that you expect them to. We're almost always surprised. And those surprises are where the Lord seems to do some of His most remarkable work in transforming us, in changing our lives. And I want to have the perspective going into it of faith, of trust in God. So that's what I want to learn about Him, is I want to learn how trustworthy He is, that when I go into a situation like this, I know who He is because I've seen this is how He always works in the Bible. It's how He's worked in my life. It's how He's worked often in world history. Like, and even if things are bad, from our vantage point, it doesn't mean that the Lord has no purpose. And it doesn't mean that He can't work good out of that. Of course, we look to the cross utmost in that. But I think even practically speaking, and I'm sure, Jonathan, you could look at that in your own life. I can look at it in mine and say, the reason I'm at the Gospel Coalition is because I was not ready to be a pastor and was not hired to be a pastor at the time. And I'm grateful for that. It also led us to Birmingham. I'm glad that we're here. All these things have happened in my life in part because God did not give me what I wanted. And so I want to continue to be faithful. I want to see Him as trustworthy on the outset of things. And I do think that's something He's been helping me with during this pandemic. And it's brought a lot of encouragement that even though all my hopes for all these different things have been dashed here, and I don't really know what the future holds, this is what the Lord wanted for me. It's what He wanted for us. and he's working good, even if I don't yet see exactly what it is.
Collin Hansen, I'm grateful for you, grateful for your friendship, as well as your ministry to the capital C church, as well as your own local church. Good to be with you.
Thanks, Jonathan.